Good morning. How are you? Oh, good. Find a seat and we'll start. I could use some help this morning. We are in Acts chapter 20. Acts 20. We're not quite done with Ephesus. We're going to see Paul talking to the Ephesian elders next week. And I've got some material out in the foyer for next week's class. You might have noticed as you came in, I put the class material out in the foyer, and the bulletin's off to the side, but we'll hopefully be able to make our way through verse 16 this morning. And although the lesson is titled The Raising of Eutychus, there's a lot else that happens in Acts 20 verses 1 through 16. I'm glad you're here. We had a busy weekend, including a wedding in Victoria, and glad we're back now. We got more rain. Yay. All right, we're going to divide our class today, verses 1 through 16, into three sections. However, I added a fourth, a collection not in Acts. We're going to spend a few minutes talking about that. Our focus is on Acts, what it talks about. And we haven't really gone a lot into Paul's letters that will parallel with material that we're reading here in Acts. But we will just a little bit this morning. I want us to start by looking at verses 1 through 6. And this is a bit of a summary, but it's really important information. We started the last major section of Acts last week, chapter 19, verse 21, and I mentioned this concept of a double trajectory. I just like the sound of it, so I'm going to say it again. In Acts 19, verses 21 and 22, Paul, in the Spirit, determined that he is going to go to Jerusalem, and then he's going to go from Jerusalem to Rome. So he's going to go east, and then he's going to go all the way beyond where he's gone, to Italy in the west. Will he get to Rome? Yes. But in the way that he thought he was, no. He will actually be a prisoner. So at this point in the book of Acts, we've got this sense of inevitability. Because he doesn't say, I might make it to Jerusalem and then Rome. I must. And Jesus will reinforce that in chapter 23, verse 11. So this is different. It's not so much a travelogue anymore, where he's going here and he's going there and doing this. He's staying in locations as a prisoner. And we will get to that in chapter 21. So chapter 21. And we'll be getting to that very, very soon, in a couple of weeks. All right, Mark. So in Acts chapter 20, we read, after the uproar ceased. What uproar are we even talking about? This is chapter 20, verse 1, the riot at Ephesus. After the uproar ceased, Paul kind of took the hint and said, you know what, maybe it is time for me to leave Ephesus after all. And he sent for the disciples, and after encouraging them, there's going to be a lot of encouragement in chapter 20. And here's the first of them. After encouraging them, he said farewell and departed for Macedonia. So this word has been used a lot, and it's basically a word for greeting. And it appears all throughout Paul's letters. At the end of his letters, when he says, he sends greetings. But here it's translated as farewell, and that is appropriate because this whole section is like Paul's big farewell. When he meets with the Ephesian elders at the end of chapter 20, he will tell them, many of you you're not going to see my face again. This it smacks of this sense of this is it. Paul is not going back through this path again. He is going to Jerusalem, and then he's just going to go on to Rome. That's his plan. And so there is this sense of closure. And so he, after encouraging saints, he bids farewell and departed from Macedonia. When he had gone through those regions and had given them much encouragement, ding, ding, there's the second time, he came to Greece. Macedonia, that's the northern part of Greece. Greece, I think, is referring to Achaia, which is the southern part of Greece, but Luke just refers to it as Greece. What were some of the churches in Macedonia, in the northern part of Greece, Europe? When Paul went from Troas, he went to Neapolis, and then Philippi is in Macedonia, Thessalonica, Berea. Then he makes his way down to Achaia. Athens, part of that, but where did he stay a year and a half in Achaia, in the southern part of Greece? Starts with a C, ends with H. They make leather and columns. Corinthians. Yeah, so in the southern part of Greece, Corinth. That's probably where he went. I mean, I don't know why Luke didn't say with much encouragement he came to Corinth, but maybe he went other places there as well. But he spends 3 months, and what causes him to leave is a plot that is made against him by the Jews. Now, we've seen this. This is par for the course, right? But only after Paul's really preached. Here he is, they're seeking him out with a vengeance. And this is something we have seen a lot. But he then decides to set sail for Syria. He has decided to set sail for Syria, but instead he is now going to go up into Macedonia again. So he had just come from Macedonia, and now he's going back into Macedonia. So why did Paul change his plans? Why did Paul change his plans? Well, take a look at what I've got highlighted here. Yeah, there was a plot made against him. Okay. Y'all wake up. I know it's dreary outside, but why don't we start over? Let's just start over. Paul is on his farewell tour here in Acts chapter 20. He goes through Macedonia and then, I suppose, Achaia, but it's called Greece. He's encouraging folks right and left. He wants to go to Jerusalem, right? And then after he gets to Jerusalem, his long-term plan is to go to Rome. We saw that in Acts 19, 21, and 22. But right now he's focused on Jerusalem. He wants to go and travel straight there to Syria and then on to Jerusalem. But he can't because he has to change his plans. He's not going to sail directly there. Instead, he's going to go back into Macedonia. Why? Because he found out about a plot against him by the Jews. All right, let's take a look at verses 4 through 6. Sopater, the Berean, son of Pyrrhus, accompanied him, and of the Thessalonians, Aristarchus and Secundus, and Gaius of Derbe, and Timothy, and the Asians, Tychicus and Trophimus. All right, it doesn't just list a bunch of names. How many names, by the way? How many names there? 7. Isn't that interesting? It doesn't say 7, but it lists 7. And then it starts listing where they are from. Berea. Had Paul been to Berea in his missionary journeys? Yes. Where? Where in Acts? Acts chapter 17. That's what I want to hear. Thessalonica. Had Paul been to Thessalonica? You bet. Got kicked out of Thessalonica. Where was that recorded? 17. What about Derbe? Had he been to Derbe? Yeah. 14. First missionary journey. And Timothy. Where was Timothy from? He doesn't mention this here, but Timothy was from Lystra, neighboring Derbe. So second missionary journey. The Asians, I think that would be referring to the province of Asia, the most prominent city being Ephesus, where Paul had just been. So he's got Tychicus and Trophimus with him. Why are these places mentioned? Why are these names mentioned? Because I think this is Luke's way of saying, hey, we're moving on here, but he's also taking us back to what we have been reading about since Acts 13, really, and all the places that Paul has gone. We don't see this a lot, but what we realize is Paul is surrounded by people. All these people from Europe who are traveling with him toward Jerusalem. And so we shouldn't lose sight of that. He has very loyal people who are with him. And we're going to see Aristarchus again, of course, Timothy as well. There is another person that is never named in the book of Acts, interestingly, and he was a constant companion of Paul, and that's Titus. I don't know why Titus is never mentioned in the book of Acts. There's speculation about that he was somehow related to Luke, but no, I don't know. And so I think this is also very interesting, not only that all these people are surrounding him from places that he has been and had success teaching the gospel, but it also says that we sailed away from Philippi and after the days of unleavened bread, and in 5 days came to them at Troas. But it says right before that, these went on ahead and were waiting for us at Troas. Why does Paul send them on ahead? Maybe to get things set up, I don't know. And it says it took them 5 days to get from Philippi to cross the Aegean Sea and make it back to Troas. 5 days. What's really interesting about that is when Paul went from Troas to Philippi, actually Neapolis, the coastal city, then traveled to Philippi, it seems like it just took them, no time at all. They just got there and went on. And so I'm reading about that, saying, well, why is that? Apparently, heading toward the east, you would have winds that were preventing you. So Luke is giving us yet another little detail. And by the way, he said, we did this. We traveled. And what does that tell you? Luke is right there with them. So we're right back into another we session. So this also connects with previous material, because earlier Paul went from Troas to Philippi after the Macedonian call. Now he is going from Philippi to Troas. He is back on Asian soil as of chapter 20, verse 4 and 5. I guess I didn't put verse 6 on the screen, and so let me read that. I thought I did. We sailed away from Philippi after the days of unleavened bread. Okay, that was verse 6. All right, for just a moment, we're going to stop reading Acts 20, and I want to remind you of some verses from 1 Corinthians 16, Romans 15, and 2 Corinthians chapters 8 and 9. You don't need to turn there. I have the pertinent verses on the screen. Why is Paul going to Jerusalem? According to the book of Acts, what is the reason he wants to go back to Jerusalem? But that's not in Acts. That's the thing. This collection that Paul has been making is not in Acts at all. Now, is there another collection when he went to Jerusalem? Yes, at the end of Acts 11, verses 27 through 30. That's not this collection at all. That was years ago. And so I just find this very fascinating that Paul is making this collection. And so he is in Macedonia, talking to these churches in Macedonia and Achaia. That's all Greece. The southern part of Greece is Achaia, and that's where Corinth is. And he's writing to them and saying, on the first day of every week, let each one of you set aside and store up so that there will be no collections when I come and when I arrive. So he's writing 1 Corinthians from Ephesus, planning to go through Macedonia and Achaia, and he's writing to them saying, I'm coming. Get your collection ready. That's 1 Corinthians. The next letter Paul is going to write is Romans. And he's going to write that from Corinth. And he says, I am going to Jerusalem, bringing aid to the saints in Jerusalem. This is not Acts. And so he says, Macedonia and Achaia have been pleased to make contributions and for the saints among Jerusalem. Why was this collection so important to Paul? Because he is collecting funds from Gentiles to give to Jews. Why was that so important to him?
It was a way to unite both sides.
Yeah, we're both uniting the Jews. That's exactly what Paul wanted. He wants everybody to be one great big happy family. And the collection among the saints in Macedonia and Achaia by Gentiles is going to help solidify the relationship between Jew and Gentile. That's what he's hoping. That's what he wants. Does he take the collection back to Jerusalem? He sure does. And that is not mentioned in Acts at all. So we're moving now to 2 Corinthians, and it's chapters 8 and 9 which really focus on the collection. And he's writing to the Corinthians, and he hasn't gotten their collection yet. He wants their collection. He's coming. He's really close at this point. We want you to know, brothers, about the grace of God that has been given among the churches of Macedonia. Macedonia, the northern part of Greece, is not rich. Corinth is. It's got lots of affluent folks. Coastal city. They've got 2 ports. They've got lots of commerce. They're well-to-do in Corinth. And what Paul says to them is, the Macedonians gave. Now, maybe they're not going to give $1 million like you guys are. They're just going to give $100. But they gave out of their poverty. In fact, he says they gave first of themselves. So what's Paul doing here? As he's writing to the Corinthians, telling them about the selflessness of the poor Macedonians. What's he doing? He's laying it on thick. Why? He wants them to open their pocketbooks, their checkbooks, cut them a check. And he makes his way to Corinth. And so he says they gave of their means, not as we first expected, but beyond what their ability was, begging us earnestly for the favor taking part in the relief of the saints. That's verse 4. I'm now going to highlight 2 Corinthians 8, verse 9. 2 Corinthians 8 and 9, those 2 chapters are the heart of 2 Corinthians. And I believe 2 Corinthians 8, verse 9 is the heart of those 2 chapters. Really, the whole reason Paul, I shouldn't say that. The main reason Paul wrote 2 Corinthians is for the collection. He's dealing with some other issues, but the main reason is, guys, now's the time. And he lays on them this beautiful verse that is one of my favorite verses. Jeremy, you can read this at my funeral, okay? 2 Corinthians 8, verse 9. For you know the grace of our Lord Jesus, that though he was rich, yet for your sakes he became poor, that you through his poverty might become rich. Isn't that beautiful? Nestled right there in this passage about, give me your money. But is that how Paul appeals to them in 2 Corinthians? Does he say, I want you to know, brothers, about the money God has given to you and how you need to give it to them? The grace of God. The Corinthians are the recipients of the gospel, the saving gospel of Jesus, in part because the Jews are the ones who were the keepers of the oracles of God. They're the ones who had the promises of Abraham that have now been given to all the world. And so you Corinthians, you Gentiles, are simply giving back a portion of the spiritual legacy that you have been given by the Jews. That's how Paul basically frames it. So we don't know anything about this collection from the book of Acts. Why not? I mean, Luke was there. He knew what was going on. He knew why Paul wanted to make it to Jerusalem. Why do you think he doesn't mention it at all? He's the narrator. He gets to pick and choose the details he includes. Why do you think? Why do you think Paul did not mention the collection in the book of Acts? This is the part where you talk.
Maybe it's timing for some reason.
Okay, timing. Maybe it's timing.
We're waiting for 3 years.
Well,
It wasn't an urgent requirement at that time.
say that again.
It wasn't an urgent requirement at that time.
Maybe it wasn't an urgent requirement.
At that time.
Okay. What is Luke emphasizing? What is he emphasizing here in this section of Acts, Acts 20? It's not about the collection. It's about
The cohesion of the Greeks and
okay, all right. Well, very good. I think a big part of it is he is emphasizing Paul's destiny, Paul's commitment to going to Jerusalem. It's not so much about the collection. That's why Paul is going to Jerusalem. But Luke is emphasizing Paul is going to Jerusalem, and he is imitating Jesus in this regard. We don't talk a lot about, in our study, we haven't talked a lot about connections between Acts and Luke. But who also set his face to go to Jerusalem? Luke 9, verse 51. Traveled to get there across Luke 10 through 19 and went there to die. Well, that's Jesus. Paul doesn't die, fortunately, but he also has set this trajectory. I must go to Jerusalem. And Paul is imitating Jesus in this regard. Luke is focusing on that so much that he doesn't want us as readers, perhaps, and I don't know if this is the reason, to get distracted and just focus on Paul's pull by the Holy Spirit. Acts 19:21. I cannot overemphasize the importance of these verses. After these events, Paul resolved in the Spirit to pass through Macedonia and Achaia and go to Jerusalem. And after I have been there, he says, I must see Rome. Acts 19:21 and 22. He is on his way to Jerusalem. He's in a hurry, in fact. If you look at verse 16, Paul was hastening to be at Jerusalem, if possible, on the day of Pentecost. That's verse 16, the last verse we're going to try to get to this morning. Yes, sir. Let me go back here. Yes, sir.
You were looking back there. I thought okay, I just wanted to mention the fact that I think one of the things that was in Paul's mind, now it's not really dealt with, but you get it from before his early life in Christ, that he felt like he was the apostle to the Jews, although God chose him for the Gentiles. I think he wanted to preach in Jerusalem. It was something that he desired to
Okay.
do. But also, I think he's got that great desire to go to Rome. He's got this to take care of before he gets
Right.
there. And so he's hastening to go to Jerusalem. And I like to look at that. It states that how he's in a hurry, and yet he takes time to stop and be with the brethren,
Okay.
especially at Troas, and to be there on the Lord's Day.
Very good, very good. So Acts says nothing about the collection. It's focusing on Paul going to Jerusalem. And there is a sense of I mean, I hate to use the word destiny, but this inevitability, how about that? Must happen. And that will dominate the flavor of the next several chapters. I've got to get to Jerusalem. I've got to get there. Luke says, I don't want to mention the collection because I want people to focus on the importance of following this trail. He must go to Jerusalem. And we will see what will unfold. As readers, we know what happens, right? We know what happens when he gets there. What happens to Paul when he gets to Jerusalem? He's arrested. Yeah. We're going to see more and more about that in chapter 21. So we're getting there. Chapter 20 and 21. All right, let's talk about the raising of Eutychus. By the way, the name Eutychus basically means lucky. You know anybody named Lucky? Nickname? You do? Your brother, Lucky. Is he lucky?
To me, he was the most unluckiest person here.
Okay, to you, he was the most unlucky person. I remember one time when I changed my phone number. I think I mentioned this before, but just laugh and act like you don't remember it. But I changed my number, and I kept getting phone calls from people. You know, I'd answer hello, and they'd say, Slim? And I would say to them, I think you have the wrong number. Well, this guy's lucky in that Paul was there to help him out. This is probably one of the most famous verses in the book of Acts. Acts 20, verse 7. On the first day of the week, when we were gathered together to break bread. So this is what happened. On the first day of the week, he made it to Troas, and they went down to Luby's and had a meal. Is that what this is describing here? What do we say this is describing? On the first day of the week, on Sunday, when we were gathered together, for what purpose? To break bread. We say this is referring to the Lord's Supper. It doesn't call it the Lord's Supper. Now, I believe this is the Lord's Supper being described here. And then in verse 11, it is going to talk about them breaking bread and eating. And I think that is a meal. In fact, it's the next day, in the early morning. And this we have seen before in Acts 2, when we read about them in Acts 2, verse 42, breaking bread as part of the instructions that they're receiving from the apostles. And then a few verses later, it says that they broke bread from house to house. And the only other time we have this presented where two breaking breads are mentioned is in Acts 2 and here in Acts 20. Yes, sir?
Is this the first day of the week?
Yes, sir.
Isn't that unique also?
Okay. So,
Sabbath,
right. So in the New Testament, there is a shift where we see examples of Christians meeting on Sunday, and it starts with Jesus' resurrection. It wasn't on a Sabbath that Jesus rose from the dead. He rose on the first day of the week. The day of Pentecost was a holiday that was always, just like Mother's Day is always on Sunday, Pentecost was always on a Sunday. We start seeing saints meeting on Sunday, the first day of the week. Why do we meet on the first day of the week? To partake of the Lord's Supper. Acts 20, verse 7. That's right. That is why. Now, why don't we partake of the Lord's Supper on Monday or Tuesday or when we meet on Wednesday? Why don't we?
Because the biblical example is on the first day of the week.
That's right. On the first day of the week. And to us, that makes sense because what are we commemorating? Jesus' resurrection, which happened on what day of the week? Early on the first day of the week. So I wish the Bible just came right out and said, no more Sabbath, just worship on Sunday. But it's everywhere in the New Testament. And there's one more at the end of our Bibles, Revelation. Where was John when he received the vision from Jesus Christ, the revelation of Jesus Christ. Where he was on the island of Patmos, and what day of the week was it? It says on the Lord's day. What's the Lord's day? It seems to be Sunday. You, sir, can leave now. I believe this is referring to the Lord's Supper. And so this is what our application class is going to be on this Wednesday. And I've got material out in the foyer for that, if you'd like to take a look at my 3 points. But it's about the importance of us worshiping and why scheduling worship and not missing the assembly of the saints is so important. The benefits of our worship. Here is Paul wanting to be in Troas so that he is there on the first day of the week. What does that tell you about worship with the saints to Paul? It seems to suggest this is very important to him. And so what Paul did is preach to them. So verse 7 says that he intended to depart the next day, and he prolonged his speech until midnight. So we are talking this morning about apostolic authority, examples of Christians meeting on the first day of the week. We also then have in this verse apostolic authority. We have examples of the saints listening to the preacher until midnight. And so this morning's sermon is going to be the longest sermon you've ever heard. We're going to go till midnight. There's a story that is told. You remember Eutychus is going to fall out of a third-story window because he fell asleep at Paul's preaching. And there was this preacher, James P. Miller. James P. Miller, he traveled all over the country preaching meetings. And one time he went a little long, and this older lady said to him that he went long. And he said, well, you know, ma'am, that Paul preached until midnight. And she said, I'm going to tell you 3 reasons why that does not apply to you. Number 1, you are not the Apostle Paul. I can't remember the second one. The last one she closed with is, if one of us died, you couldn't raise us from the dead. Oh yeah, he wasn't going to see, the second one was, that was the last time they were going to see him, and we have to see you 7 more nights. So there, I got it. Ruined the joke. Verses 8 through 10. There were many lamps in the upper room where we were gathered. So Luke's eyewitness to this. And a young man named Eutychus, lucky, sitting at the window, sank into a deep sleep as Paul talked still longer. And then it says, being overcome by sleep, he fell down from the 3rd story and was taken up dead. Oh no! But Paul went down and bent over him, and taking him in his arms said, do not be alarmed, for his life is in him. Whoa. Doesn't this seem like a strange story? I guess maybe nothing like this had ever happened, and so Luke's recording this? Probably not. He chose this incident for a reason. Why? So let's finish. Let's finish through verse 12. When Paul had gone up and had broken bread and eaten, he conversed with them a long while until daybreak, and so departed. And then he closes this out with Eutychus. They took the youth alive and were not a little comforted. There's another example of his sarcastic exaggerations, we might call them. Latotes, remember that's the technical term. What does this remind you of when you read about a young man being raised from the dead? Does this remind you of a couple of prophets from the Old Testament? Okay, from the Old Testament. Elijah and Elisha. And I think it's closer to Elisha, actually, but here is Elijah stretching himself upon the child, crying out, "Oh my Lord, let this child's life come into him again." That contrasts with what Paul said in verse 10, "Do not be alarmed, for his life is in him." Now, here Elijah said that his life has left him, let it come back. And then also in 2 Kings chapter 4, Elisha lay on the child, putting his mouth on his mouth, his eyes on his eyes. He stretched himself upon him, and the flesh of the child became warm. So you've got both Elijah and Elisha resuscitating a young man. Why? What's going on here? Why? I mean, is there a valid comparison to be made between Paul and Elijah and Elisha? Is this also perhaps going back to Peter raising Tabitha from the dead? Or Jesus and his resurrection activity? And I also find it interesting that it says in verse 8, "There were many lamps in the upper room where we were gathered." Why is that mentioned?
The room warm.
Okay, so the room is warm, and that compels this young man to fall into a deep sleep. What do you think? Is that why the lamps are mentioned? I don't know. I tend to think that.
I was preaching in Mexico one time where they didn't have electricity, and it was at night, and they had kerosene lamps, and I had a hard time keeping myself awake
Okay.
from a headache.
Yeah.
I think it really shows the power of God. If you want to compare it to Elijah in 1 Kings chapter 17 and 18. So in chapter 17, the widow sees the power of God only really here. Chapter 18, everybody sees the power of God when Elijah defeats, the prophets of Baal. Here, everybody that's there would have seen the power of God. And
Yeah.
so if you want to compare it to Elijah, I think that's the comparison.
Why is 1 Kings 17 and 18 so much on your mind, Larry?
Talk to me next week.
Okay. On Sunday nights, we are studying 1 Kings with Larry. He's doing a great job teaching. I'm going to go back for just a moment. You don't have to turn there if you don't want to. Let me read to you a couple of verses from Jesus in Luke chapter 12. Luke 12, verse 35. He's speaking to his disciples, and he says, "Stay dressed for action and keep your lamps burning." Verse 37, "Blessed are those servants whom the master finds awake when he comes." So I was doing some reading last night after the wedding. I was reading on this, and I'm still struggling. Well, why is Eutychus mentioned here? I mean, what is it? Is there some, this is what Luke does. He mentions some things that aren't as straightforward in our understanding of why the lamps are mentioned. Is it possible the author of both Luke and Acts is referring back to Luke 12, verses 35 and 37, because it talks about staying awake, and it also talks about trimming your lamps? I think the Eutychus symbolism is asking us to not fall asleep or succumb to the darkness. Paul is going to be warning about persecution that is coming. Now, the fact is Eutychus fell and he died. And Paul says, oh, no, he's not dead. His life is still in him. Well, that sounds like another story from Luke, when Jesus raises the little girl of Jairus. She is not dead. Her life is still in her. We have not talked about the connections between Luke and Acts. We've talked a lot, especially in Acts 1 through 12, about the connections between Acts and the Old Testament. But I think in the latter part, Luke is especially emphasizing connections with the earlier part of Acts and the Gospel of Luke. And I wonder if this is part of that. So the message I would take from this right now in my thinking is we are being warned through the example of Lucky that we need to stay vigilant as evil and persecution comes our way. What do you think of that? Is there some validity to that, or do you think, oh, Mark, that's just ridiculous?
I think watching and waiting should always be on our mind.
Okay, watch and wait with your lamps trimmed and bright. Always be ready, because the darkness is coming, and we need to be awake. Sleepers awake. We need to be fully awake. So this morning, I'm going to be watching really closely to make sure everybody stays awake. Okay. I don't know. I'm still studying and thinking about that, but I wanted to bring that up. All right, we've got a few verses left here, Acts 20, verses 13 through 16. And this is a travel log, but we've got some important details here. As we start this section, I've highlighted on the screen the places he's gone. And I don't have a map on the screen, but I do in the material. And it mentions these places: Assus, Mytilene, Chios, Samos, Miletus. Which of those is the most well known to us? Chios? Which one? Of those, which do you recognize? Miletus. Why? Don't be shy. Because who is Paul going to meet at Miletus? The elders of the Ephesian church. Okay. That wasn't so hard. And so he is asking these folks to meet him. Paul had decided to sail past Ephesus so that he might not have to spend time in Asia, for he was hastening to be at Jerusalem, if possible, on the day of Pentecost. So that's what he's working toward. And so it says that he had arranged for himself to go by land while his buddies travel by boat. Why? Why did Paul travel by land while the rest of his folks went along the Aegean Sea, across those islands, and made their way they met him at Miletus? Why? We're not told, so why do you think? Sir?
So he could read the details.
Well, they're all going to meet up at Miletus. So why does Paul from Troas by land? Sorry, I didn't ask that well enough.
That's where the people are.
All right, people. It doesn't mention anything here specifically about him meeting with people, but I bet that's what he did. And he is encouraging them. And he's probably doing a lot of the kinds of things he's going to do with the Ephesian elders, encourage them to be aware and watch, be watchful. I don't know if he wanted some time to himself, but I think it's probably what Gus is saying, that he's on a farewell tour and he's trying to encourage people. Why does he want to be here at Jerusalem on the day of Pentecost? I think there's probably some significance there too, but I will tell you this: in AD 57, it would have been on May 29th. Isn't that interesting? That's when he would have reached there. This is kind of a travel log, and it's the beginning of his farewell tour, where he is saying farewell, as brought out by most English translations. And so next week, we are going to talk about this extremely important narrative where Paul gives a speech. It's not his longest speech, but it's very important. It is his only speech to Christians. Every other sermon that we have recorded, that we're told the text of, is spoken to non-Christians. This is the one that we have in detail. The meeting at Miletus. Materials in the foyer on this side, for next week. And thank you for studying with me this morning.